Stahl-Timmins, a data graphics designer at the BMG, who actually did a conference about last year, and now this year he submitted a lightning talk about graphical reviews, giving graphs and charts the attention they deserve in scientific publishing.
In scientific publishing, we spend hours agonizing over the text of articles, making sure everything is totally correct. Graphs and charts, however, seem to get much less attention. At the BMJ, aka British Medical Journal, we're exploring how we could create a community of experts that could review figures. Journals and other scientific publications like ours offer different kinds of review. Peer review is perhaps the most well-known, and for all its flaws, is an important foundation of scientific research. Journal editors rely on the expertise of peer reviewers to explain the context of a piece of research and how appropriate and important it is. According to resources available, journals might also provide editorial review to improve the structure and readability of a paper, statistical review to assess the methods used for acquiring and analysing data, and in medicine we use things like patient review to show the relevance of research to everyday people. In this process, as I mentioned, text tends to get a lot more attention than figures and graphs. At the BMJ we do redraw graphs into our house style, although many journals don't. Editors might adjust captions and labels, but don't tend to have specific expertise in the visual presentation of data. Inspired by a discussion and unconference session at Outlier last year, we've been experimenting with what we call a graphical review. I usually work on interactive data graphics and infographics for the journal, but I offered to try some reviewing of charts and graphs, and I've so far carried out 4 of these, usually when asked by an editor to take a look at a figure that they're struggling with. The first was for a population study of maternal mortality in 8 European countries. The paper had 4 bar charts, and I recommended changes to each of them. In most cases they just needed some reorganisation, but one of them I recommended replacing the stacked bars with a heat map actually, which seemed to make it easier to compare the groups vertically as well as horizontally. The second was for a paper about symptoms experienced after having COVID-19, of which there are lots. The authors provided a linked radial network diagram, and I suggested some possible alternatives for that, focusing more on different parts of the data, but in the end the editors didn't change the diagram much. They did, however, use my recommendations for the caption pretty much word for word. I did succeed in making that longer, hopefully more useful. The third was a paper on the global burden of type 2 diabetes I picked up when looking for papers to make visual abstracts on. And I recommended reordering some of the bar charts so that they sat beside the line charts they related to, and changing some bar charts into line charts, but I missed my chance, the figures had already been made by that point. The fourth was a meta-research study on reporting and sharing of review data in systematic reviews. The authors had suggested a familiar technique called a forest plot, with the addition of some bar charts. And I recommended restructuring that a little to group together similar information, and I suggested removing some colour thresholds on the bar elements, which I thought weren't needed. It seems that our design team actually undid one of my suggestions in the end by separating the numerical data on the 2 years shown in the bar charts from the 2 rows back into 2 columns. So presumably this is to increase text size for the print pages. So our processes definitely still need some work. In fact, there are many things we can improve in this process. We've seen we need to set up a proper workflow for making changes so that we don't keep changing back and forth, and that might frustrate authors. We also need to think about resourcing. The reviews took between 38 and 77 minutes for between 1 and 5 figures. We pay stats reviewers, and we need to think about how to pay graphical reviewers too. Will we actually need reviews for all papers, or can we educate our editorial staff to pick up more of what's needed and escalate to graphical reviews only when necessary? And capacity matters too, and if we do want to make sure we can cover the 3 or 4 papers we publish a week, I definitely can't put 5 hours a week aside. And also, there are people in the Data Visualization Society with much more knowledge about graph types than me. So maybe others at the conference would be interested. If so, do let me know. Lastly, we need to make sure that editors know the service is one that we offer. In the last year, we've only had 3 submitted and 1 that we volunteered ourselves. This may become more embedded as we change the way we make graphs to a more data-driven approach, but that is for a different talk, maybe at next year's Outlier conference. Thank you for watching my talk. I still use Twitter if you'd like to follow me for occasional commentary on initiatives like this and the graphics that we publish, or check my blog page for freelance work, and do get in touch if you'd be interested in doing graphical reviews, or to commission me for D3 coding or other data graphics design work.
How do you coordinate with people who might have different languages? Like, for example, maybe a researcher or a designer wouldn't know what a heat map is, or wouldn't know they would want to do a certain type of graphic but wouldn't know how to call it. And then how do you address these different type of languages and contexts that people might have?
That's true. We all have our technical language, don't we, in the data visualization world, and it's sometimes hard to remember that actually they don't see these every day, some of these techniques. I suppose it's a gradual process of education if you're talking about working with journal editors, and that's good because you can, have that relationship that you form. When you're talking to an author who has maybe submitted to lots of different journals and hasn't come across some of these techniques before, and trying to get them to change their minds and do something different, that can be more challenging. I think that maybe is something that we need to work on more.
Okay, great. We do? Okay.
Not working.
Yes.
Two online questions. One is from Andrew Noe. Great talk. You mentioned the workflow of reviewing data graphics needing improvement. Can you talk about some changes that would improve the workflow?
Yeah, well, I wish I knew. Then I would make them. Well, clearly it just needs a little bit more attention in terms of what point the graphical review happens. Clearly, we don't want to have to papers go through a submission process. If it's too early on and we end up rejecting a paper, then an author might end up doing a lot of work for us to change it into a format that we want, that another would then end up going to another journal, and then they'd have to change it again, perhaps. So we need to make sure it's not too early in the process, but obviously one of them I picked up far too late in the process, and some changes have been made by other people and without me knowing about it. So we need to find that sweet spot in the middle, really. Thank you.
You said there was another one?
Here. Hi, I'm Rodolfo. I'm curious about how open are authors to these changes in their charts, or are they sometimes kind of protective of the visual solutions that they're already used to?
There's a really big range, actually, in some of the research we've been doing with authors recently on this kind of thing. Some really love having some help because it's not something that they've come across before in other journals. And some are really familiar with their own statistical tools and have their own, ways of doing it, and they're much more confident. So I suppose maybe it's about gauging that level. It tends to be, I guess, slightly more senior researchers maybe have done more data visualization, but it doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's early career researchers who just have an interest in that. So I suppose, testing the water with them and finding things out is part of the process. And I suppose it's always going to be a negotiation, in a sense, to say, we think, how about this and this? And sometimes, as in one of those examples, they've said, no, I'm going to do it this way, I like it. Which is fine, but it's just giving people the opportunity to consider some things they might not have heard about before, if they're not familiar with heat maps.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you.
There was one more?
There is one from Veronica Zapotoksny. Do you have a resistance from authors when providing or suggesting improvements? And if so, how do you work with that challenge?
Is that similar to the question just before, I suppose? Did I have, I didn't quite hear, did I have what from authors? Sorry. Resistance from authors, so yeah, same thing. Yes, sometimes. Sometimes we will have to go with what they want, I guess, at the end of the day. But we like to see if we can persuade them to try some other things out. And usually we can.
Well, okay, the last one.
Promise is very short question. Is this a paid service? Because I came from research from before, and I can only imagine that an author would like the help to showcase their data. But I don't know if maybe researchers are not using this because they have to pay this extra service, and they think, oh no, I'm capable of doing everything. That's why scientists do everything. But this is where I try to do the same exact thing. So this is a thing I wonder, is it because people have to pay extra for this, or they just don't want the help, or just have done this for so many publishers that they don't want to switch their data and the way they analyze the data?
I mean, I think most authors would say that our article processing charges are already high enough without having to pay anything extra. So we're thinking this will work like a statistical review, which we do get for papers, and that it will be rolled within those charges that we do. Having said that, we publish 60 other journals, and they have much lower article processing charges, and therefore it might not be very easy to find the resource to do that within those. So we might be looking at a more paid model for that. And initial research has shown us that people are sometimes willing to pay for that. It depends on their context, and I think there's a real problem potentially with equality and around the world, particularly the global south. It's much harder to find extra cash for doing things like that would be able to support that. So we need to think carefully how we do that, and we do have waivers for people from the less rich countries, and we might have to do something similar with graphical reviews. Thank you, that's a good question.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Will.
Thank you.